Hi students, this is the last video for this week, the last lecture video for this week. We've talked about Indian geography, kind of the basic geographic foundations of this society we're studying. We've talked about its very earliest society, Stone Age India. You could say it's not even a society, but its very earliest historical and prehistoric remains. Now we're going to talk about the Neolithic Revolution. In this class, we're studying history rather than archaeology or biology. We're not particularly going to worry about trying to nail down exactly when the first human beings came to India. But we're going to start with the period where we first find evidence of settled life and settled communities in India. And that's dated to around 10,000 years ago. And this is the process called the Neolithic Revolution. If you've all taken Western Civ 1, you should be very familiar with this concept, the idea when human beings they're no longer living as hunter-gatherers, where, as we've seen, Stone Age Indians live. They live off the plants and fruits that they find in Indian wildlife, and then later they hunt Indian animals and hunt and eat Indian animals. Instead, they become sedentary human beings. They settle in particular places, and they start to live in settled societies. This development is a fundamental development to the study of human history. These settled societies are what are going to produce human remains, particularly written human remains that are fundamental to our study of these past societies and civilizations as the homes and the commonalities that we find in other human beings. So the Neolithic Revolution speaks to the universal dignity of human beings. It speaks to the fact that human beings want to live in society with one another. It speaks to the fact that human beings have this ability to change the way they live. You look at any other living being on Earth, and it's living exactly the same way as it was 10,000, 15,000 years ago. Human beings are the only living beings that are able to change the way they live in this way, that have the boldness, the rationality, the consciousness to change the way they live. So the Neolithic Revolution is very important in showing the dignity of human beings and their ability to think rationally, their ability to problem solve, their ability to make changes to their lives. By the time we come to around 5000 BC, we will find that agriculture seems to be well established in India, and that agriculture provides the foundation for these Neolithic societies. People are now living as farmers in settled areas and are creating homes, permanent homes for themselves. And so I'm just going to outline some of the oldest Indian remains, the remains of some of the oldest Neolithic societies that we find in India. Balochstan in the northwest. This is actually one of the driest parts, driest climates in India. It's hot and it's dry, and this supports the idea that the Neolithic Revolution doesn't occur necessarily because the fertility of the earth is increasing with the end of the Ice Age. That is now more associated with the Paleolithic period, the period when human beings are living as hunter-gatherers. In fact, the Neolithic Revolution occurs because the fertility of the earth is actually slowing down. That now you've had the melting of the glaciers, the end of the Ice Age, you've had this great explosion of life across the earth, and now that's coming to an end. Now we're actually seeing the temperatures of the planet cooling a little, rebalancing a little. It's not the case that there's an overabundance of food. In fact, the human population is growing. Food supply, at least the uncultivated food supply in the wild, is decreasing, and human beings are making these changes in order to confront this problem, in order to confront and to resolve this problem. So that's what's important to remember about Balochstan. Balochstan shows us that, or is evidence at least, for the idea that the Neolithic Revolution occurs as human beings are trying to resolve a problem rather than human beings are taking advantage of greater fertility and greater abundance in the earth. Not definitive by any means. There are going to be these debates about the Neolithic Revolution that are going to continue, but at least in ancient India, we find support for this thesis that the Neolithic Revolution occurs because the fertility of the earth is slowing down. Second site we find is the Zob River Valley. And so up here at the top right, we have remains from Baluchistan. When we look down here, we have remains from the Zob River Valley. So this is the third key term that you have to remember from this week. Why is the Zob River Valley important? It's important because of the fertility rituals that we have evidence from here. So the figurines that have survived from the Zob settlement suggest that we have a religion that's being practiced in this society, and that it's based on, or it's focused on, achieving fertility. It's focused on achieving and cultivating the fertility of the planet that has made agriculture and the cultivation of plants and animals possible, which in turn has made these settled civilizations possible. What I want you to take away from the Zob settlements is that religion is present from the very earliest remains that we have of Indian society. A lot of times there's a tendency to say human beings kind of lived without religion in these societies, and then religion was imposed as a means of controlling these people. It's certainly true, of course, that there are rulers and figures throughout history who are going to use religion in this way. But I think it's important to remember that this isn't the origins of religion in India, and increasingly, as we look at the evidence, in other societies. That religion is something that develops very organically in these Neolithic societies across the world, especially in India, that these people recognized that there were aspects of their life that they could not explain without reference to a spiritual or a supernatural reality. And we find that very much as part of the human experience of the Neolithic Revolution. The last settlement that we're going to look at is the settlement of Amri. This is a river settlement. This is the first settlement in the Indus Valley. You'll remember perhaps from your Western Civilization 1 classes that river valleys are commonly at the heart of early civilizations. The Nile in Egypt, Euphrates and the Tigris in the Middle East. We're going to see this in ancient China as well. And Amri is the earliest settlement we find in the Indus Valley. And it's at this point that we start to find remains of cities rather than just farming villages. And so we don't really know how long it took to make this transition from villages to cities, but we find these cities in the Indus Valley. This is where we're going to find the earliest civilizations, historic civilizations in India that we're going to be looking at next week. We find the remains that we find in Amri are the remains of pottery that you see at the top of the screen here. And so it's a kind of crude handmade pottery, but it shows that these people are storing food, that they have the fires necessary to create this pottery and to fire this clay. The other regions across India generally are either are too arid, too dry, too hot to be cultivated until we find better technology developing than we find in the Neolithic period. Nevertheless, the regions of India that we find other regions of India are exceptionally fertile. So we're talking about areas where we have 5 times the amount of rain per year that we have in Portales, which is a pretty dry part of North America. But these parts of India are exceptionally fertile. And so once agriculture takes off in these areas, we're going to find 2-3 crops a year being grown in these regions. This is going to support a very large population, which is what we've come to associate with India today. Interestingly enough, the more arid regions of India that aren't being cultivated immediately, that have a pretty similar yearly rainfall to Portales, there we find sugarcane being the crop that's grown. The more fertile areas, rice is what's being cultivated, but sugarcane is able to be grown even in the more arid areas. I don't know whether this means that you can start a sugar crop in Portales. I guess it depends on whether the patterns of rain throughout the year are the same, but perhaps something to look into. Just kind of closing up here, what we start to find in the Neolithic period is that tools become more sophisticated. We start to find chisels, hammers, and so tools that are being used to make things rather than just making a spear. You're making something in order to make a better spear. So the creation of tools, technology is becoming more sophisticated at this time. We find spears, bows, and arrows that are all improving. We find swords that are being made of polished stone. So weapons are still being made out of stone. All of these materials are being made out of stone, but they're becoming more sophisticated than they had been before. Here are examples of some of these tools that we're going to close with today. One point that I want to make that I always emphasize to my upper division classes is that this Neolithic Revolution, this process, this transformation of human living from nomadic hunter-gatherers into sedentary farmers, it isn't something that happened immediately. When we're doing the survey classes, we're having to move through a lot of material very quickly. You kind of have to say, well, then the Neolithic Revolution happens. And it makes it sound like like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, just happened in a number of years. That's not the case. This change in the way human beings live, it's going to take many, many years to unfold. And it's important to remember that for much of this period, we find that human beings are living in sort of halfway houses. They're still partly hunter-gatherers. They're becoming more settled. Maybe there are a number of different sites that they'll live at different points of the year while they're still pasturing herds of animals that need to move to different grazing lands, or they're still kind of following the herds of animals. So the Neolithic Revolution is a process that takes time. And so this is important for all of you as history majors, those who are taking more advanced courses in history. It's very important for you to remember. And I think India encapsulates this brilliantly because of the fact there are still societies in India today that have not made the Neolithic Revolution. There are still societies today that live as nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. This was about 50 years ago, but as large a population as 30 million. That would be a tenth of the population in the modern United States, still lived in pre-Neolithic societies. So Neolithic Revolution is a really important point, a really important foundation for the study of history, but it's important to remember that it's an ongoing process, that there's a real complexity to the Neolithic Revolution that I think it's important that you understand. So these are the takeaways that I want you to have from this week. Questions I want you to think about as you look through the material. Number one, to what extent does geography shape and influence India? Why is it that we think about India as a unified society when there's such a great diversity of languages and cultures and geographic phenomena that we find in India? So I want you to think about those questions for geography. For the Stone Age, think about those questions of common ancestry. Is it the case that we see change because a new population has come in, or is change something that's consistently happening over time? If we see common practices across societies separated by thousands of miles, does this mean that these societies have a common ancestor, or does it mean that all societies developed in the same way? And then when it comes to the Neolithic Revolution, Neolithic India, the importance of religion, religion is something that at its origins is something that more and more seems to be organic rather than something that was imposed. And to think about how this is something that took many, many generations, something that's still ongoing. And what does it say about human beings' ability to change the way they live and their ability to, or their desire to live in community with each other? I hope you've enjoyed the material this week and look forward to seeing you next time.